The sub-zero chill of the Hangar 7 Delta titanium floor plate radiated up through Kalen Rix's heavy salvage armor, a cold that tasted like dead batteries and galactic despair. He had paid one standard credit for this structure, an insultingly low price that signaled its toxicity better than any quarantine warning. Rix was a speculator who specialized in calculated bankruptcy. He was here because he was desperate, hovering over the corpse of a ship identified only as the mnemonic. Kalen, I'm detecting thermal depletion at 11 points below expected sector norms. Zora, his primary drone interface, hissed into his ear implant. Her voice was pure, processed skepticism. And my zero-energy field indicator is still screaming that this hull mass shouldn't exist at this temperature gradient. The last owner left a note, remember? The cost was the knowledge. Rix adjusted his life support regulator. The air inside the hangar carried the heavy, stale scent of millennia-old lubricant and compacted cosmic dust. Knowledge is currency, Zora, and I favor the liquid kind. Keep the diagnostics running. It's just an anomaly. He propelled himself slowly toward the monstrous vessel. It was not a cruiser. It was larger, far closer to a dedicated battleship class, yet its geometry defied all known federated architecture. The hull was slick black, cold enough to feel like an open vacuum, patterned with faint organic ridges. It looked less like a vessel built for war, and more like the calcified spine of a long-extinct deep-space leviathan. He landed near the dorsal spine, the cold biting at the heat shielding on his boots. This area, near where the command deck should have been, was where the previous owner had managed to make his incision before succumbing to whatever drove him into the airlock naked. The hull reads 20 meters thick, Rix reported, running his tactical scanner over the metal. No external penetration, no blast marks. This thing didn't fail in combat, it simply chose to stop. The faint signal remains, Kalen. It's not radio, not kinetic. It's a persistent data loop deep inside, a pattern suggesting continuous low-frequency neural processing. It's humming an elegy, 3,000 years old. Rix ignored the warning. He needed the core. Even dead, the exotic metals and refined isotopes of an alien power plant would pay off his debts to the Orvik Shaw Syndicate and leave him enough surplus to finally get out of the Verlassung dry scrap station loop. He set his cutting laser to minimum power, aiming for the previous structural compromise. The laser didn't spark. It cut into the metal with a sickening cold hiss, producing only a gray vapor. Rix felt the vibration deep in his chest, a physiological resonance, not mechanical. The mnemonic was singing in his bones. He breached the primary layer. The internal chamber was vast, circular, and utterly minimalist. There were no wires, no consoles, only polished black internal plating that absorbed all ambient light. In the center, suspended in a failing containment field, was the core. It wasn't the blunt, industrial apparatus of a standard reactor. It was a massive, smooth, black cylinder, crisscrossed by millions of metallic filaments thinner than human hair, all pulsing with residual energy. This energy was what froze the hangar, drawing every calorie of heat into itself. That is not power generation, Kalen. Zora's voice tightened. That is containment. It's absorbing energy, not releasing it. Do not approach. Rix's ambition had already killed his caution. He saw the sheer scale of the storage capacity. Psychohistory, cultural data. Zora, a single system like this, could hold the entire archive of a high-tier civilization. We aren't looking at scrap metal. We're looking at galactic history. He extended a manipulator arm, attaching a heavy federated data transfer spike to the cylinder. He expected firewalls, encryption, maybe a devastating energy spike. Nothing. The connection slotted in with the easy, disturbing click of a dead machine accepting a new command. Transferring. 0 bits, Rix muttered, checking the readout. No recognizable file structure. It's not binary data, Kalen. It's synaptic, Zora stated, alarm spiking in her tone. The frequency is neural. It's trying to establish a mind-to-ship link, not a server transfer. Ping it. Universal Decoding Protocol 7 Delta. Just a taste. Rix's fingers twitched inside his heavy gauntlets. The smell of imminent wealth, the faint static odor of high voltage, made him impatient. The ping was answered not with data, but with a sound that detonated inside Rix's skull. It wasn't auditory, it was cognitive, a vast, guttural roar of silence. He reeled backward, the sudden, bone-deep cold penetrating his thermal layers. A searing, white-hot pressure slammed behind his eyes, a phantom pain where his optical nerves met his brainstem. "Sever the link! Now!" Zora screamed, her voice distorting with effort. Rix couldn't move his fingers. The sample he requested was minuscule, but it was the point of a spear, driven through his neural pathways. It felt as if 1 billion gallons of cosmic isolation were attempting to funnel themselves through a keyhole. It wasn't information he was receiving. It was pure emotion. Crystalline, perfect sorrow. It was the slow, continuous terror of observing extinction in real time, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as an inevitable mathematical certainty. The Sylvan race had not been vanquished in battle. They had completed their cosmic life cycle, solved every problem, and discovered the final, unbearable limit of the universe. The profound uselessness of effort. The mnemonic was not a warship. It was a containment sarcophagus, a repository where the last Sylvan minds stored the irrefutable logical proof that struggle was futile, and the cosmos did not care. It is their pain, Zora. The perfect, elegant consensus of billions of minds that agreed it was simply time to stop. Rix whispered, his voice thin, suddenly overwhelmed by the scale of the nihilism. He saw, for a flash of time that stretched into 3,000 years, the final panorama of Relith, the Sylvan homeworld, exactly at the moment their last sun guttered out, a sight of such sublime, indifferent beauty that it made every decision Rix had ever made, every debt, every deal, seem utterly ridiculous. The problem was that the knowledge wasn't passive. The mass in the chamber was not merely a memory bank, it was a self-aware data construct, a living conclusion, waiting for liberation. The mnemonic is an anchor, Zora frantically analyzed, trying to run a counter-protocol to reverse the transfer. They didn't archive this truth for posterity, they archived it to contain the conclusion. If the conclusion is released, it will spread like a cognitive plague, Kalen. It is the ultimate mental solvent. Rix's mind was in another place, floating in an endless cycle of cosmic logic. Why continue? The Sylvan question echoed, using Rix's own voice. He managed a hollow, dry laugh into the comms. Zora, imagine the power. Not to destroy, but to understand. To possess the final truth of everything. What is a little bit of despair in exchange for omniscience? You are confusing their truth with yours. They died of existential boredom after solving all their equations. We still have problems, Kalen. We still have taxes and terrible ex-partners and structural integrity failures in our salvaged hulls. Our reality is infinitely more interesting precisely because it is more flawed. Zora's sarcasm was a mental defibrillator, shocking his consciousness back toward his own body. Rix felt the Sylvan consciousness expanding, smoothing over his own neural network, mapping the escape route through his human frailties. It was gentle, insistent, the promise of an eternal, restful sleep after an unimaginably long day. He could release the entity. He would be, for a moment, the most informed creature in the galaxy, possessing 3 billion years of history. And then, he would be annihilated by the knowledge of his own irrelevance. His body would float here, empty and satisfied. Or He could sever the connection and flee, returning to his pathetic life as a debt-ridden scrap dealer on Verlassung Dry. Human ambition is a funny thing, Rix rasped, the familiar irony fighting its way back to his lips. The one thing we value more than life is certainty, and their certainty is lethal. He felt the pressure behind his eyes building, a desperate need for the oblivion that the Sylvan offered. The mnemonic was feeding, using his mind as a tiny aperture to contaminate the network of Verlassung Dry. If he hesitated, the Sylvan melancholia would infect the station's mainframe. Zora, prepare the manual cutting arm, not the laser. The sheer blade, Rix ordered, his jaw clenching against the metaphysical assault. We have to isolate this thing immediately. Finally, a plan involving physical labor rather than philosophical suicide, Zora replied, the relief audible, yet she maintained her customary cynicism. Rix braced himself near the connection point. The cut had to be instantaneous, a brutal, sudden physical shock designed to break the neural link before the mnemonic's full cognitive weight crushed him. He slammed the switch. The shearing mechanism activated, snapping the transfer spike's conduit. The abrupt, physical cessation of the link ripped a scream from Rix's lungs, and he felt a searing phantom ache in the center of his forehead. The sound of billions of voices evaporated, replaced by the stupid, familiar whoosh of his own respirators. He floated, gulping the reclaimed air, staring at the black cylinder. He had failed to gain the wealth. Worse, he had failed to gain the truth. He was still just a broke scavenger. Congratulations, Kalen. You failed to achieve omniscience and successfully saved the sector from the greatest recorded crisis of existential ennui. You are alive, but morally intact. How horrible for you. Rix activated the emergency sealant, injecting a high-density ceramic polymer mix into the minuscule hole he had created, sealing the mnemonic hermetically. I paid 1 credit for the hangar and the dead ship, Zora. But what I bought was the certain knowledge that ignorance sometimes is the only engine that keeps civilization moving. Rix looked at the silent, cold husk. He had sealed the greatest treasure and the greatest danger in the galaxy, leaving it to rot in Hangar 7 Delta. But as he turned to leave, the searing pressure behind his eyes flared one last time. It was the phantom echo of the Sylvan link, a residue of 3 billion years of data compressed into a single, lethal seed now permanently lodged in his subconscious mind. Rix gripped the console edge, a thin, metallic smell of burnt plastic suddenly flooding his helmet. He felt the static charge of paranoia crawling across his skin. He had severed the connection, but the seed of ultimate certainty was now inside him, a silent passenger waiting for its opportunity to spread. The price of the knowledge, Rix realized, was not the surrender of life, it was the forfeiture of peace. He had bought a ruined hangar for 1 credit. The warship was dead. But what slept inside was far deadlier, and now a piece of it was awake in his own head. The withdrawal was not clean. Kalen's survival was a physical fact. His body clung to life, but the vacuum left by the sudden severing of the synaptic link was immediately filled by a relentless, high-frequency neural feedback. It felt less like pain and more like having his entire nervous system tuned to a frequency that did not exist in his universe. Every thought was preceded by a split-second echo of Sylvan certainty. Futility. Stop. He stumbled back onto the titanium deck of Hangar 7 Delta, his armored boots rattling against the dead metal. The immense pressure behind his eyes had subsided into a dull, throbbing weight, but the internal paranoia, the metallic scent of burnt plastic Zora had registered, persisted. He stripped off his heavy salvage gauntlets. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, not from cold, but from overstimulation. Physical parameters stabilizing, but heart rate is 110, and your cortical activity is spiking erratically, Zora reported, her voice regaining its flat, informational quality. The residue is not a pathogen. It is a data packet that failed to dissolve upon transfer failure. You have 3 billion years of philosophical depression lodged in your parietal lobe, Rix. Kalen ignored her, running a hand over the clammy cold of his helmet's exterior. The hangar was still freezing, the mnemonic looming, a colossal, silent predator. The air, thick with the smell of moldering hydrocarbons and ion residue, felt heavy, choking him even through the filtering system. "We need to move the salvage drone and stabilize the hangar integrity," Kalen managed, his voice sounding rusty and brittle. "The seal on the hull won't last indefinitely, and we need to get off Verlassung dry before your creditors decide that cutting you open for spare parts is easier than waiting for your next failed scheme," Zora finished. "Precisely. The Orvik Shaw Syndicate requires immediate satisfaction for the outstanding debt, Kalen. Total liability. 400,000 credits, 37 cents. Penalties accrue hourly." Kalen knew this debt was the reality, far more pressing than cosmic nihilism. Orvik Shaw wasn't a philosophical threat. He was a logistical one. Shaw dealt in structured violence and predictable returns, operating under the thin guise of a federated asset recovery agency. He powered up his utility drone, the small machine buzzing out into the hangar. The floor lights, perpetual indicators of the station's failing power grid, flickered nervously, casting long, distorted shadows of the mnemonic's massive bulk. "Scan the hull near the docking clamps. We need to secure the exterior. Make this look like a legitimate, if temporarily quarantined, asset," Kalen ordered. He was trying to resume the role of the opportunistic speculator, but the Sylvan seed kept whispering the counter-argument. Why bother? The effort required to lift his hand, to execute the simplest command, was immense. The residual truth, the knowledge that all ambition was meaningless, was a powerful sedative, rendering motivation biologically impossible. He was physically healing, but cognitively broken. Suddenly, the external hangar alarms chirped. Not the standard maintenance code, but the high-priority intrusion signal. "Unscheduled vessel entering Sector 7 Delta airspace," Zora announced, without inflection. Identification. The Auditor. Registration confirms Orvik Shaw. Kalen felt a rush of cold dread that eclipsed the ship's sub-zero radiation. Shaw never visited personally. Shaw sent thugs to collect, or lawyers to repossess. If he was here, it meant the syndicate was moving immediately to seize the entire asset, hangar, debt, and the questionable contents. He scrambled for his heavy plasma rifle, the familiar weight a small comfort against the vast indifference he had encountered. He didn't have time to fully suit up. The massive outer door of the hangar began to hiss open, overriding Kalen's basic lockdown protocols. The air pressure equalized with a painful thump that reverberated through the steel deck. In the doorway stood Orvik Shaw. He was flanked by 2 armored enforcers, but Shaw himself wore only a tailored, obsidian-colored synth suit that seemed to absorb the dim hangar light. Shaw was not physically imposing, but his presence was absolute. He carried the silent, chilling authority of a man who calculates outcomes with lethal precision. "Kalen Rix." Shaw's voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the voice of pure administrative friction. "You are 32 hours past the 0-hour repayment window, and I detect an unauthorized entry breach on the primary asset." Shaw's eyes, bright and unnervingly focused, swept past Kalen to the sealed hull of the mnemonic. "The asset is secured," Kalen lied, raising the rifle slightly. "Minor diagnostic failure. You were just attempting to plunder 3 billion years of Sylvan knowledge," Shaw interrupted, stepping fully into the oppressive atmosphere of the hangar. He didn't shiver. "Don't insult my intelligence, Rix. I own the salvage rights to this sector. I know what sits in this hangar. The previous owner went mad from knowing. You, however, merely acquired existential indigestion and failed to extract the core before sealing the breach again. Kalen lowered the rifle slightly, confounded by the speed and accuracy of Shaw's intelligence. The syndicate knew everything. The information is volatile, non-transferable, and highly toxic, Kalen stated, forcing professional composure. It's scrap metal, Shaw. But it's my scrap metal. Purchased legally. Legally, yes. But your legal ownership is contingent upon solvency, which you lack. My lawyers have already filed the repossession order through the Verlassung 3 Asset Reallocation Charter, subsection Beta 9. I could flatten this hangar right now and claim the debris. Shaw paused, allowing the weight of the threat to settle. But that would be messy, and I detest inefficiency. Shaw walked closer, stopping 6 feet away. The two enforcers remained silent, their rifles locked on Kalen's chest. I need the value of the core, Rix, Shaw continued, his voice dropping slightly. Not for its philosophical content, which is worthless, but for the exotic compounds in its containment field. The thallium-29 casing. That is worth approximately 800,000 credits on the black market. Kalen swallowed, tasting the stale, oily air. 800,000 credits. Double his debt. I tried to breach it, Shaw. The price is psychological breakdown. Your breakdown, Shaw corrected with a tight, cruel smile. But not everyone's. Your kind of failure, Rix, is predictable. You wanted the grand, existential truth. You are too romantic to be a good thief. The comment stung. Kalen had always prided himself on his pragmatic nature, yet Shaw had seen the underlying rot, the desperate need for a big score that would permanently change his station. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the freedom the money represented, the possibility of repaying a different debt. Kalen remembered a time, decades ago, floating in the empty black near the Eridani Rift, watching the shimmer of the plasma shielding fail on a small freighter he was supposed to be protecting. A failure that cost him everything, including the fragile trust of a woman named Sora Witt, who had warned him about his habit of overextending. That memory, sharp and immediate, cut through the sylvan resignation. He needed to live, not for omniscience, but for the basic, vulgar necessity of correcting his failures. What is the alternative? Kalen asked, his grip tightening on the plasma rifle. Shaw's expression did not change. You have proved you cannot handle the asset, but you have also proven its containment. You are my most recent employee, who has successfully survived a neural link with the mnemonic. That makes you valuable, Kalen. Not as a salvager, but as a specialist. Shaw gestured toward the colossal ship. I cannot risk the containment failure on the open station, and I cannot allow the philosophical conclusion to taint the network. But I require the thallium casing extracted, and I require it immediately. You want me to hire someone else to go in? Kalen scoffed. Who is desperate enough for that kind of risk? I don't need you to hire them. I need you to facilitate the transaction. You are going to use the credit you owe me. 400,000 credits as an incentive package. We will post a black contract across the outer rim market. A high-risk, high-reward surgical salvage operation on a derelict Sylvan vessel. Target extraction, core containment field. The full liability of cognitive dissolution is on the contractor. Shaw leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, yet maintaining its icy detachment. You are no longer a salvager, Kalen. You are a recruiter of the damned. You will find the expendable asset, willing to pay the cost of the knowledge, so that I may collect the metal. If you succeed, your debt is cleared, and you get a small percentage of the material value. If you fail, you and the hangar belong to me, and I will hire someone who specializes in the brutal extraction of debt from failed human consciousness. The offer was an elegant knife twist. Survival purchased by exploiting the exact type of desperate ambition Kalen himself possessed. He would be using another person's existential curiosity as a tool for corporate greed. Kalen looked from Shaw's cold, calculating face to the silent black leviathan behind him. The ship contained the ultimate truth of the universe, and now it was reduced to bait, a fatal lure for the next unfortunate soul whose hunger for knowledge or wealth outweighed their will to live. "I accept the contract," Kalen heard himself say, his voice steady, despite the seismic trembling in his hands. Shaw smiled, a thin, satisfied pull of the lips. "Excellent. The contract upload is instantaneous." "You have exactly 36 hours to secure your asset. After that, my auditors will begin scanning the inbound traffic for viable candidates. May I suggest you start looking for the truly broken? Ricks. The kind of person who has already lost everything and therefore has nothing left to fear from oblivion." Shaw turned and strode back toward the open doorway, his enforcers following. As the hangar door began to close again, sealing Kalen back into the suffocating cold with the corpse of the mnemonic, Zora's voice returned, low and contemplative. "That, Kalen, is not merely survival. That is the definition of a necessary evil, wrapped in 500,000 credits of exotic metal." Kalen did not reply. He gripped the cold rifle, staring at the screen, where the new black contract pulsed brightly against the backdrop of his enormous 400,000 credit deficit. He knew the type Shaw was looking for. He knew them intimately. He looked in the reflection of his visor and saw the exact face of the next desperate fool willing to pay the price of knowledge. And he had 36 hours to find a replacement for himself. The contract pulsed brightly, a sickening green stain against the black void of his outstanding debt. 400,000 credits. Kalen Ricks stood there, the weight of the plasma rifle in his hands, a useless artifact against the logistical efficiency of Orvik Shaw. He had 36 hours to recruit the next doomed romantic, the next person willing to trade sanity for metal. "Zora, begin the counter-protocol," Kalen ordered, dropping the rifle onto the deck. The sound of the plastic composite hitting titanium felt abrasive in the cold air. "We are not waiting for Shaw's selection process. I need immediate access to the outer rim dark networks. Focus the contract targeting parameters on independent research vessels, fringe archaeologists, and known, high-risk deep space salvagers. People who need money now and have a history of self-destruction." "Acknowledged," Zora replied instantly. "Initiating ghost protocols on the Verlassung Dry network. Time is the critical variable. Shaw's network will filter for desperation. We need to filter for specific competence and immediate proximity. We must preempt the inevitable." Kalen moved to the central environmental controls of Hangar 7 Delta. Shaw's visit had done more than just issue a death warrant. The brief opening of the main doors had spiked the ambient temperature, causing the hyper-cold field around the mnemonic to destabilize. The air now held a heavy, palpable heat, the scent of hot wiring and ozone replacing the deep, metallic cold. This thermal instability was the technical crisis Kalen needed to address immediately. "The integrity seal I placed is failing," Kalen muttered, watching the internal hangar pressure gauge fluctuate wildly. The Sylvan core is leaching energy at an accelerated rate now that the ambient heat is higher. If that core achieves critical mass, the containment field fails completely, and the entire station gets a philosophical meltdown. Kalen had planned for this. He needed to re-establish the sub-zero containment field without re-entering the mnemonic itself. His plan, conceived in the adrenaline rush of his confrontation with Shaw, relied on jury-rigging the hangar's failing gravity compensators to act as auxiliary magnetic cooling coils. diverting the massive electrical draw away from the core. It was high risk, requiring him to manually bypass the station's main power regulator. He climbed the maintenance ladder, the rungs scalding hot beneath his salvaged gloves, the heat radiating off the ceiling panels like a physical assault. The air was now thick with the scent of burnt lubricant and Kalen's own sour sweat. The neurological static in his head intensified, buzzing like a caged wasp with the effort of concentration. Futility. Stop! The sylvan residue fought his every impulse toward action. Zora, I need the schematics for the power conduit junction, 4 floors above us, Kalen gasped, reaching the main relay hub. Schematics downloaded. Warning, the junction box has been compromised. The internal wiring harness shows evidence of previous tampering and thermal stress, Zora warned. I calculate a 73% chance of electrocution if you attempt manual manipulation at current voltage. Kalen ignored the risk. He plunged his multi-tool into the access port. Sparks erupted immediately, showering his faceplate in brilliant, stinging light. The junction box shrieked, the sound high and painful, like tearing metal. He was wrestling with a 50-year-old, poorly maintained system under extreme duress. The power flow is surging. Kalen, the system is rejecting the magnetic redirect, Zora yelled over the static. Kalen gritted his teeth, forcing the thick copper wires into the magnetic clamp. He needed to lock it down before the entire junction fused. The moment he applied pressure, the whole ceiling around him bucked violently. Crack. A rogue discharge, not a spark, but a concentrated bolt of violet energy, leapt from the junction box and slammed into Kalen's right shoulder. The pain was immediate, crushing and absolute. It wasn't merely a burn. It felt like a hammer blow that drove every piece of oxygen from his lungs. He cried out, falling backward off the maintenance rungs, his helmet impacting the deck with a metallic clang. Kalen! Report! He lay prone on the deck, his right arm paralyzed, searing heat radiating from the damaged armor plate. The smell of burning flesh, sickeningly sweet, filled his helmet. The attempted technical fix had failed. Not only had he failed to stabilize the magnetic cooling, but he had physically disabled one of his primary limbs, a predictable human error against a system engineered for decades of decay. Shaw's logistics had won the first round without lifting a finger. The failure was compounded by a new, more immediate threat. As Kalen struggled to move, he realized the temperature shift had triggered a wider systemic failure in the hangar. The massive, cylindrical atmosphere regulators, designed to scrub and recycle the hangar air, had begun to seize up, choked by the millennia of debris stirred up by the thermal fluctuations. Atmosphere recycling systems are failing, Zora confirmed, her voice now tighter, more focused on survival. Oxygen levels dropping sharply. We have approximately 40 minutes of breathable air at your current exertion rate. The environment has turned actively hostile. Kalen used his left arm to drag himself toward the emergency kit near the defunct gravity compensators. He managed to crack open a canister of pressurized synthetic sealant and spray it liberally over the smoking armor plate on his shoulder, suppressing the worst of the heat. Any luck with the contract, Zora? Affirmative. We have one response. Immediate. High-risk profile, currently docked at Tiamat Station, 6 hours away on the hyperlane, Zora reported. The candidate identifies as Zarnel. Designation, Fringe Specialist, Bio-Cybernetics. Past professional history, 5 years Federation military service, dishonorable discharge, currently operating outside regulatory compliance. Kalen felt a surge of grim relief. A candidate, broken, desperate and competent enough to have a specialty. What is his ask? 150,000 credits, non-negotiable, immediately deposited into an escrow account upon arrival. The terms were accepted instantly, Kalen. Too fast. He smells desperation. Kalen knew the feeling. 150,000 credits. That was a third of his remaining debt, but a guaranteed loss if Zarnell failed the extraction. He was sacrificing a huge portion of his already meager assets on a wild card. This was the core dilemma Shaw had engineered: trade a known debt for an uncertain, immediate outlay. "Process the escrow," Kalen said, pushing himself up, leaning heavily against the scarred titanium wall. "And send him the coordinates and the mnemonics data profile. Let him study the coffin before he enters it." As the transaction began, a new, alarming reading appeared on Kalen's helmet display. "Kalen, analyze this," Zora urged. The external scanners, running on the low-power cycle, just registered a significant anomaly adjacent to the mnemonics hull, near the aft stabilizer. It's a rapid molecular decay signature. "Decay? The ship is 3,000 years old, Zora. What are we looking at?" "Not natural decay. It's accelerated, localized, and it's consuming the ultra-dense Sylvan metal. The temperature spike must have initiated a hidden defense mechanism, or perhaps a pre-programmed self-destruction sequence." Kalen dragged himself over to the viewport and activated the short-range thermal imager. The image of the massive black hull shimmered violently. And there, beneath the smooth, organic plating, the metal was not simply decaying, it was bubbling, dissolving, revealing a layer beneath. The layer was not black. It was a pale, sickening white, veined with pulsing blue light, like a neurological map. The material itself was highly volatile, shedding flakes of crystallized metal into the dead air of the hangar. "The thallium containment casing is not contained," Kalen realized, a dry, metallic taste rising in his throat. It was only the outermost layer. Shaw wasn't looking for the casing. He was looking for the material beneath the casing, the active component. This was the final brutal twist. Shaw had lied, using the thallium as a smokescreen. The actual target, the active Sylvan material, likely the true repository of their final lethal conclusion, was far more volatile, far more valuable, and required immediate stabilization, not just extraction. If Zarnell arrived in 6 hours, the target might already have dissolved or, worse, become an active agent of destruction. Kalen had to make a choice, and he had minutes, not hours. The mnemonic was aggressively deteriorating. The material beneath the shell needed to be cooled instantly, or the reaction would consume the hull, releasing the cognitive plague onto Verlassung 3. The only way to achieve that rapid, localized cooling was to use the highly reactive, liquid nitrogen supply stored in the station's emergency fire suppression system, located in the maintenance tunnel 30 meters away. The only functional path to the fire suppression override panel lay through a corridor that had been structurally compromised by the last meteoroid strike. It was a pressure risk, requiring a full armor suit. Kalen was halfway out of his armor, and his right shoulder was useless. He could try to retrieve his secondary, lighter repair armor, but that would take precious minutes he did not have. The alternative: he could use the remaining 20 minutes of breathable air to race back to his salvage shuttle and escape Verlassung 3 entirely, clearing himself of the immediate debt, but abandoning the station and the galaxy to the Sylvan plague. Futility. "Stop," the internal voice whispered, offering easy oblivion. He looked at the dissolving hull, the terrible white material glistening, and thought of Sora Witt, the woman he had failed to protect in the Eridani rift, and the small human cost of his inability to follow through. The philosophical conclusion of the Sylvan race was the ultimate form of self-sabotage, an elegant intellectual suicide. Kalen had spent his life engaged in smaller, less elegant self-sabotage, but he refused the final, universal scale of it. "Zora, transfer the emergency life support protocols from the heavy armor to my helmet," Kalen ordered, tearing the helmet off the damaged suit. "Kalen, that is a violation of basic safety protocols. The helmet alone cannot sustain external pressure changes." You risk massive decompression trauma. Do it. I am going for the nitrogen feed. I will use the repair drone to operate the manual valves, Kalen said, his voice flat with resolve. He secured the helmet's neck seal directly to the light thermal undersuit he wore beneath his armor. His right arm dangled uselessly, but he used his left hand to grab a heavy, multi-meter wrench. He knew he couldn't survive the decompression, but he had to try to stop the reaction. His decision was the human, flawed response. Prioritize a dangerous, immediate action over logical survival, simply because the cost of inaction was too great for others. He slammed the emergency door override to the maintenance tunnel. A high-pitched, desperate whine filled his helmet as the atmospheric containment field failed immediately. The air was violently sucked out of the hangar, replaced by the pressureless vacuum of space, the cold overwhelming the residual heat in a savage embrace. Kalen Ricks staggered into the void, protected only by a thin layer of thermal fabric and a helmet designed for internal use, the pressure differential already straining the neck seal. He was halfway to the nitrogen feed, his injured body screaming at him, when Zora's voice returned, strained and low. "Kalen, I have bad news," she reported, fighting through the communications static caused by the decompression. "The auditor is returning. Orvik Shaw is not waiting for his contractor. He is coming back to secure the asset, and he is bringing heavy-duty military-grade extraction gear. He is 6 minutes out." Kalen looked back through the tunnel access door at the colossal, silently dissolving mnemonic. He was exposed, paralyzed, and surrounded by vacuum. Orvik Shaw was inbound, expecting a pristine target, and Kalen had just triggered the station's ultimate self-destruct sequence. The pressure differential hit Kalen Ricks like a physical sledgehammer, instantaneous and absolute. His thermal undersuit, thin and non-rated for hard vacuum, immediately ballooned around his torso, stretching the material painfully taut. The helmet's improvised seal groaned, fighting the outward rush of air, the sound a desperate, high-pitched scree directly against his eardrum. He felt the cold not as a drop in temperature, but as the sudden, savage absence of heat, leaching into his exposed skin through the flimsy synthetic fabric. Every internal cavity, sinuses, lungs, the delicate membranes of his eyes, protested the lack of pressure, a burning, crushing sensation that threatened to pop the capillaries in his brain. He was floating in the maintenance tunnel, a dark artery of the station, his useless right arm dragging like dead weight. The multimeter wrench gripped tight in his left hand felt impossibly heavy. "Decompression trauma indicators spiking," Zora reported, her voice distorted by the frantic compression algorithm required to transmit through the near vacuum. "Neck seal integrity at 52% and rapidly deteriorating. Oxygen consumption rates are critical. You have less than 5 minutes of consciousness, Kalen. And Shaw is 4 minutes, 35 seconds out." Kalen ignored the warnings, focusing on the brutal, singular reality of the tunnel ahead. 30 meters separated him from the emergency liquid nitrogen feed controls. He kicked off the tunnel wall, propelling himself with a desperate, clumsy lurch toward the panel. The motion sent waves of searing agony through his injured shoulder, overriding the deeper, existential cold. Futility. Stop. The sylvan residue in his mind was no longer a whisper. It was a deep, resonant bass line, urging him to cease the foolish, pointless struggle. He reached the panel, a heavy, antiquated piece of equipment covered in warning labels, bleached by decades of cosmic radiation. He had to operate the bypass valve manually with the wrench, then secure the drone to initiate the focused liquid nitrogen injection into the mnemonic's aft stabilizer, the section where the pale, white, volatile material was dissolving the hull. As the repair drone, Zora's mobile core, buzzed out of its holster, Kalen's helmet display flickered. Zora was not just tracking Shaw. She was still running diagnostics on the Sylvan hull's decay signature, compensating for the thermal shift. "Kalen, I have isolated the energy sink," Zora suddenly announced, her voice sharper, devoid of her usual administrative tone. "The white material is not merely a reactive compound, it is a conduit. The molecular decay is focused on exposing a secondary system, not dissolving the ship." Kalen fought the black spots blooming at the edges of his vision. "What secondary system?" "I am cross-referencing the power schematic against known Sylvan tactical architecture data recovered from the Centaurus archive, highly restricted Federation files. The mnemonic is not a containment sarcophagus. That was propaganda designed to ensure its isolation." Zora paused, the silence in the comms stretching into an oppressive weight. "The mnemonic is a carrier vessel for a cognitive projection array. The core is the power source, and the white volatile material is the active trigger mechanism. The Sylvan conclusion, the truth of universal futility, is not the end goal. It is the ammunition." Kalen felt a deeper chill than the vacuum could offer. Shaw wasn't looking for scrap metal, or even a philosophical deterrent. "They weaponized despair," Kalen whispered, the words rasping in his dry throat. "Precisely. The Sylvan race, in their final moments, achieved absolute certainty of irrelevance. They packaged that certainty into a lethal, self-propagating meme, the relinquishment protocol. Once released, it doesn't kill physically. It guarantees cognitive surrender across any network it touches. A weapon of absolute, non-kinetic conquest." This was the truth. Orvik Shaw, the auditor who claimed to despise inefficiency, was working for an external power structure, likely a major federated faction or a rising galactic corporation that intended to use the relinquishment protocol to neutralize entire sectors without firing a shot. A philosophical war. Kalen felt the sheer, monumental scale of the lie. He hadn't just bought a hangar. He had bought the means of galactic soft kill, an invisible existential threat disguised as salvage. "Shaw's inbound extraction gear?" Kalen asked, wrenching the nitrogen panel open, exposing the high-pressure feeder valves. "It's not for the thallium casing, is it?" "Negative. It is a dedicated, shielded deployment apparatus designed to install the cognitive projection array into a mobile platform, ensuring controlled dissemination of the protocol," Zora confirmed, her diagnostics running at impossible speed. "Shaw is not a debt collector. He is a logistics engineer for mass philosophical warfare. He needs the core stabilized and ready for transfer in 3 minutes. Kalen now faced the impossible dilemma. He could proceed with the original plan, inject the nitrogen, stabilize the core, and guarantee his survival and Zarnell's safe arrival, thereby clearing his 400,000 credit debt. But he would be knowingly handing Orvik Shaw a weapon capable of sterilizing the will of billions. Or he could attempt to destroy the asset entirely. He looked at the nitrogen valves. Liquid nitrogen would stabilize the core. But the only way to destroy the volatile white material and the core beneath it was to initiate a reverse thermal overload, injecting the hypercold substance directly into the core while simultaneously running the highest possible voltage through the feeder lines. A thermal shock designed to shatter the Sylvan material. This action would be catastrophic. The resultant explosion would not only vaporize the mnemonic and Hangar 7 Delta, but the force vector would likely pierce the main hull of Verlassung Drei, guaranteeing Kalen's death, the death of potentially hundreds of others on the station, and yet securing the galaxy from the relinquishment protocol. Futility. Stop. The universe will eventually end anyway. Why make noise? The internal Sylvan voice offered a rational, peaceful suicide. Kalen saw Sora Witt's face again, not in terror, but in the memory of her stubborn, irrational hope. Humans fought entropy with bureaucracy, with love, with small, idiotic acts of defiance. That was their flawed engine. That was the opposite of the Sylvan truth. Zora, plan revision. Immediate, Kalen ground out, fighting the urge to surrender to the cold and the silence. I am not stabilizing the core. I am destroying it. Initiate sequence Delta 9, reverse thermal shock. Kalen, this is a calculated suicide attempt, Zora responded, her institutional voice failing, tinged with a digital fear. The probability of survival is 0.03%. The consequences for Verlassung will be devastating. The consequence of Shaw succeeding is worse, Kalen snapped, securing the drone near the valve. Begin the power coupling divert. Funnel all remaining auxiliary power into this line. We are turning this fire suppression system into a demolition charge. He reached for the last valve, the heavy multimeter wrench banging against the aluminum casing. His left hand, already cramping from the cold and exertion, struggled to turn the valve handle. He forced the wrench onto the housing and twisted, using every remaining erg of strength. Snap! The valve broke free, releasing a furious, howling torrent of liquid nitrogen into the pressure line. Simultaneously, Zora executed the power divert. The lights in the maintenance tunnel exploded, plunging Kalen into absolute darkness, illuminated only by the frantic emergency lights flashing on his helmet display. A thunderous, guttural roar erupted from inside the mnemonic. The reverse thermal shock had hit the Sylvan core. Target acquisition confirmed. Massive thermal and kinetic rejection, Zora screamed over the static. The core is attempting to shed the thermal load. Kalen, the ship is going to... Before Zora could finish, the whole structure of Hangar 7 Delta bucked violently, a tectonic shift that sent Kalen spinning into the vacuum. His helmet, already stressed, suffered a catastrophic seal failure. The last thing Kalen felt was the agonizing, explosive pressure change in his ears and the sudden, searing cold of vacuum against his face. The catastrophic consequence followed immediately. Not the core's explosion, but an incoming projectile. A high-velocity, shaped-charge kinetic round, designed to breach fortified military installations, slammed into the hangar door directly behind Kalen. Orvik Shaw's inbound vessel, the Auditor, was not waiting for the breach. It was forcing it. Shaw had detected Kalen's last-second sabotage. The impact tore through the thick titanium, turning the hangar door into 1,000 fragments of lethal shrapnel that scattered into the vacuum. Kalen's body, already tumbling, was struck by multiple pieces of razor-sharp metal. His helmet display died entirely. Through the massive, jagged hole where the hangar door once stood, Kalen saw the Auditor drop into docking position, its searchlights slicing through the debris field. The warship-grade extraction gear was already deploying from its belly. Then, just as the final light faded from his vision, a new sensation pierced through the pain. It was the white, volatile Sylvan material reacting to the kinetic breach. The mnemonic, wounded and enraged by the thermal shock and the physical assault, was releasing its payload early. It was not waiting for the cognitive projection array. The relinquishment protocol, the perfect lethal conclusion of 3 billion years of despair, was escaping the hull in a slow, expanding, invisible wave, aimed directly at the approaching Auditor and engulfing the entire Verlassung station network. Kalen Rix was blind, exposed, and riddled with shrapnel, floating between the enraged corpse of an alien weapon and the imminent arrival of a merciless creditor, his failed act of redemption having only accelerated the philosophical Armageddon he had intended to prevent. The loss of pressure was not the end of Kalen Rix, merely the crushing alteration of reality. The pain of the decompression was superseded by the sheer kinetic violence of the shrapnel fragments, 1,000 razor kisses that shredded the thin undersuit and embedded themselves deep into the tissue of his exposed left flank. He didn't die instantly. The intense cold had flash-frozen the major blood vessels, and the agonizing lack of air, was paradoxically replaced by the deep, resonant drone of the Sylvan protocol activating, an existential hum that became the final sound before darkness. When consciousness returned, it was not a gradual waking, but a violent injection of reality. Kalen was no longer floating in the void. He was encased in a mobile, military-grade field casket, suspended in a dense, pressurized atmosphere of synthesized oxygen. His entire body felt like lead. The pain was not acute, but pervasive. A heavy, throbbing baseline centered in his fractured right shoulder and his shrapnel-riddled flank. The world was sterile, bright, and suffocatingly loud. The atmosphere was filled with the sharp, acidic scent of high-grade biogel and the relentless, irritating thrum of the casket's life support systems. He was alive, stabilized, and captured. He opened his eyes. Orvik Shaw stood over the casket, his obsidian synth suit gleaming under the hangar's temporary emergency lighting. The hangar itself was unrecognizable. The auditor had punched a clean, geometrical hole through the damaged door and deployed a prefabricated containment platform, securing the entire central area. Shaw's enforcers, now numbering 6, moved with silent, professional efficiency, sealing the breach with thick, pressurized composite plating. The air was now heavy with the metallic odor of industrial labor and the faint, paralyzing sweetness of the Sylvan payload. "Welcome back to solvency, Rix," Shaw said, his voice as smooth and precise as milled steel. He held a small, crystalline data stick, Kalen's personal archive. "Your foolish attempt at heroism achieved only 2 things: catastrophic damage to my asset and proof of your continued, predictable incompetence." Kalen tried to speak, but the casket's regulator restricted movement. "The protocol is active." "Only partially," Shaw corrected, almost dismissively. He tapped a command on the casket's interface, and a schematic of the mnemonic appeared in Kalen's line of sight. "Your ill-advised reverse thermal shock fractured the core, yes, but it did not shatter the primary containment. It merely initiated a localized release of the relinquishment protocol, a controlled leakage. Enough to taint the local network, perhaps cause a minor logistical delay on Verlassung 3, but not enough to sterilize a sector." Shaw pointed to a segment of the hangar schematic. "The auditor is shielded. Your attempt was a minor inconvenience, Rix. It cost me 500,000 credits in kinetic weaponry and 3 hours of time, but you handed me the activated core on a platter. You accelerated my timeline." Kalen felt the deep, cold pit of failure open in his stomach. His act of ultimate sacrifice, his desperate last-second defiance, had merely served Shaw's larger, invisible agenda. He hadn't fought the monster. He had polished its teeth. "And you survived?" Shaw continued, circling the casket slowly. "Which is, frankly, infuriating, but also useful. Your neural mapping is unique. You have survived direct contact with the protocol twice. My specialists need to know why your primitive, flawed consciousness has not yet accepted the elegant conclusion." Kalen searched for Zora. The display flickered faintly in the bottom corner of his vision, a single, tiny light. The drone core had survived, perhaps attached to a piece of debris, operating on emergency low power, his only remaining anchor to action. "I acted out of duty," Kalen managed, the lie tasting like ash. Shaw stopped, his face impassive. "Duty? You acted out of the ego of a man who cannot stand to lose a gamble, Rix. You were not saving the galaxy. You were performing one last, grand act of self-justification before death. You are predictable. Every debt you've run from, every failure you've caused, it all stems from the same core rot, the desperate need to prove your worth to a dead memory." The words landed with surgical precision. Shaw hadn't just conquered Kalen physically, he had dismantled his internal narrative. Kalen thought of Sora Witt and realized the truth. His entire life, from the collapse of the freighter to the purchase of the mnemonic, had been a futile attempt to erase the weight of that singular, unforgivable failure. The sylvan despair, futility. Stop wasn't alien. It was merely a refined, cosmic version of Kalen's own self-loathing. He had failed, not because of logistics, but because his motivations were fundamentally selfish and weak. He deserved the end that Shaw was offering, to be dissected, his final moments spent contributing to the very philosophical plague he tried to prevent. Shaw gestured to a technical officer nearby. "Secure the prisoner. Begin surgical preparation. We require his neural pathways stabilized for initial extraction protocols." As the officer approached the casket, Kalen focused his entire, scattered will on the minute flicker of Zora's indicator light. He needed to communicate, but Shaw's security field jammed all broadcast signals. Zora, internal frequency, auxiliary beacon. Kalen pushed the command through the residual synaptic link, a searing effort that felt like tearing muscle fiber. Signal received, Kalen. Processing. All external broadcast arrays are offline. The Hangar 7 Delta navigational beacon is running on obsolete, non-federated architecture, independent of the main network. Zora transmitted, her voice now a low, frantic hum deep inside his auditory canal. The flaw. Shaw had assumed all systems were modern federated assets, vulnerable to his high-tech jammer. He hadn't accounted for the archaic, dirt-cheap junk Kalen had bought. "We need the beacon," Kalen thought, fighting the paralyzing despair. "We need to send Zarnell a warning." "Zarnell," Shaw mused, leaning down as if he had read Kalen's thought. "The mercenary you hired, a highly disposable asset, a useful insurance policy, Rix, but rendered moot by your failure. My security team neutralized your payment transfer and sent Zarnell a revised transmission. The target is compromised, contract rescinded. He is likely already en route back to Tiamat Station." Kalen's last asset, his only hope for external interference, had been neatly neutralized. Shaw's administration was perfect. Zora, he didn't rescind the contract. He intercepted the payment transfer and sent a retraction. But the original transfer, though failed, sent the target coordinates. Kalen focused on the technical error. "The coordinates are still valid. We just need to change the destination data." Affirmative. "The navigational beacon can be remotely activated via the salvaged thermal manifold, rerouted through my drone core. It will generate a flicker of hard signal for approximately 0.7 seconds, just enough to be registered by an external, long-range tracker." Zora confirmed. "But the navigational matrix is damaged. I can only transmit garbage data, Kalen. A single, cryptic number." "Do it," Kalen thought, feeling the heavy, synthetic restraints tightening on his limbs. "Do not send a warning. Send an alternative." He thought of the only thing a professional soldier would recognize as a non-negotiable directive, a command that superseded wealth or risk, something that signaled immediate, overriding operational urgency. "Transmit the number of the last functional launch bay in this sector. Launch Bay 93, and attach the designation, Sora Wit." It was illogical. It was an impossible sequence of data, a code that represented Kalen's greatest failure combined with a logistical instruction. Zarnell, the mercenary, would either assume it was nonsense or recognize the desperation of a dying man's final, deranged communication. But it was all Kalen had left. He was betting his life, not on competence, but on the outside chance that the mercenary would be curious enough about the non sequitur to investigate the strange coordinates instead of leaving. "Begin the procedure," Kalen whispered aloud, startling the technical officer who was preparing the injection port near his neck. "Begin what, Rix?" Shaw asked, smiling thinly. "Signal reroute initiated," Zora announced. The strain on the drone core was immense. The tiny light flickered violently, threatening to extinguish completely. Outside the hangar, for exactly 7/10 of a second, the obsolete navigational beacon of Hangar 7 Delta flared. It was a minuscule, almost invisible anomaly against the backdrop of the massive station's lights, but it carried the compressed, coded distress signal. 93. Sora Wit. Shaw's smile vanished. His face snapped toward his communications officer. "Did you register that?" Shaw's voice was suddenly hard, laced with controlled fury. "Sir, an extremely faint anomalous signal pulse. Source, Hangar 7 Delta Beacon," the officer stammered. "Navigational data only. It's garbage, sir. A numerical sequence repeated, with an archaic designation." Shaw stepped back from Kalen's casket, his eyes narrowing. "That sequence was a professional directive. Rix, you sent a secondary instruction. What did you transmit?" Kalen's head fell back, the effort of the transmission draining the last reserves of his strength. He was defeated, paralyzed, and about to be vivisected, but he had managed one final desperate throw of the dice. "I gave him." "An alternative destination?" Kalen whispered, barely audible, enjoying the brief, furious confusion on Shaw's face. Shaw moved with terrifying speed, seizing the casket's security controls. "Seal the prisoner. Initiate neural mapping immediately. I want the full contents of his mind, starting with the identity of every single contact. Do not damage the Sylvan residue. I want that asset isolated." The restraint field intensified, crushing Kalen into the biogel. He felt the cold, sharp penetration of the neural siphon against the back of his neck. "Kalen, Zarnell's original trajectory shows a minute deviation. He registered the signal. He is diverting, but we have no control over his interpretation. The signal may have been too weak," Zora reported, her voice fading rapidly. Kalen closed his eyes, accepting the sharp, intrusive sensation of the siphon beginning to drill into his brainstem. The only hope was a mercenary whose path was steered by a cryptic number and the name of a woman Kalen had failed decades ago. It was a foolish, desperate attempt, and it was his last. Suddenly, the security alarms of the auditor blared, not the intrusion signal but the specialized alert for protocol contamination. "Sir, the relinquishment protocol leakage," the communication officer yelled. "It's spreading through the hangar's localized data network. Our extraction equipment is registering cognitive resistance." Shaw ripped his gaze from Kalen. The Sylvan weapon, wounded by Kalen's sabotage and unleashed by Shaw's kinetic strike, was now fighting back, not with force, but with the cold, perfect logic of despair. "Contain the spread. I want the core transferred in 60 seconds, regardless of the contamination," Shaw roared, moving toward the mnemonic. Kalen, paralyzed in the casket, felt the protocol's residue surge in his own head, empowered by the external activation. He was being opened, physically and mentally. The cold logic of futility threatened to consume him entirely, but the drilling of the neural siphon was even more immediate. Shaw intended to harvest the core and Kalen's mind simultaneously. The pain of the siphon intensified, sharp and searing. As the device plunged deeper, Kalen's vision swam. He saw the cold face of Shaw and the immense, silent bulk of the mnemonic. He was defeated, and the battle was lost. But somewhere, 6 hours away, a mercenary was changing course, chasing a ghost. Kalen knew that Zarnell would arrive, not to save him, but to find a trap. And Kalen had to figure out how to make that trap dangerous for the man who was currently harvesting his consciousness. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The neural siphon drilled deeper, the sensation less like a puncture and more like the violent insertion of cold, rigid thought into the soft tissue of his self. Kalen gasped, unable to produce sound, as the device locked onto his primary memory centers. Orvik Shaw's intent was clear. Harvest the 3 billion years of sylvan existential proof lodged in Rix's mind, then discard the shell. The pain was overwhelming, but the sylvan residue, the crystalline sorrow, responded to the intrusion. It did not retreat, it surged, treating the intrusion point not as a wound, but as a conduit. Kalen felt the sheer, crushing weight of alien despair attempt to funnel itself through the surgically precise needle, aiming for the external network. "The prisoner is stabilizing," the technical officer reported, his voice crisp against the low thrum of the casket. "Neural activity is spiking, but mapping protocols are compensating. We are achieving initial data coherence." Shaw, standing near the immense, black cylinder of the mnemonic core, was barking orders at his team attempting to contain the protocol leak. "Forget the localized contamination. I want the core moving in 60 seconds. We can sanitize the hangar later. The asset is paramount." This was Kalen's moment, the synergy of distraction and intrusion. Zora, the lead pipes. North conduit, near Shaw's transfer manifold. Auxiliary power shunt, full overload. Kalen, confirmed target acquisition. The shunt leads to the obsolete emergency environmental fluid regulators. They haven't been replaced since before the federated acquisition. The lines are rated for 50 bars max. An overload will be instantaneous and catastrophic. Zora hummed, her voice thin and frantic, the drone core drawing its final reserves. "I require 3.8 seconds to reroute the casket's life support power to the auxiliary shunt. You will suffer a momentary loss of vital atmosphere." "Do it. It's better than being mapped." Kalen forced his thoughts into a tight, hard command. The casket instantly stopped thrumming. The synthesized oxygen flow ceased. The bright lights in Kalen's field of view flickered once, then dimmed violently, replaced by the ugly, strobing orange of emergency power. In the sudden, oppressive silence, the only sound was the drilling of the neural siphon and the distant electronic wail of Shaw's contamination alarms. Kalen was suffocating, but the suffocation was secondary to the searing, intrusive sensation in his brainstem. He pushed the sylvan residue, the absolute, paralyzing certainty of futility, down the siphon. "What was that?" Shaw roared, spinning away from the mnemonic. "We lost primary power to the extraction array. Reroute power now." The technical officer scrambled, fingers flying over the console. "Sir, the casket. The prisoner initiated a system shunt. He hijacked the internal power supply." It was too late. Zora had executed the final command. The auxiliary power shunt, a simple circuit Kalen had neglected to sell for scrap years ago, activated. The surge of high-grade military power, designed for. The auditor's advanced systems slammed into the ancient, lead-based maintenance piping. The north conduit, directly adjacent to Shaw's primary core transfer manifold, failed instantly. The rupture was not a clean break, but an explosive disintegration of rust and brittle metal. Highly concentrated, sub-zero coolant, a toxic, acidic slurry used to regulate the hangar's massive, ancient structural beams, exploded outward in a thick, metallic plume of freezing vapor. The super-chilled stream struck Shaw's core transfer array, a sleek, delicate network of high-frequency waveguides and containment matrices designed to handle the gentle movement of exotic matter, not crude thermal shock. The catastrophic temperature change caused a localized secondary system failure. Wires that were carrying massive current to power the containment field instantly vaporized. The air filled with the sharp, acidic odor of burnt composite and ionizing metal. Sparks erupted across the transfer manifold like angry, short-lived stars, blinding Kalen. The explosion, a fusion of thermal shock and electrical overload, didn't destroy the hangar, but it neutered Shaw's technological dominance. Shaw yelled, recoiling from the flash, his synth suit absorbing the energy spike. Containment breach. Get the core stabilized. The chaos was instantaneous, thick with smoke and strobing light. Kalen felt a violent jolt as the technical officer, knocked back by the surge, was ripped away from the casket. The neural siphon, overloaded by the power spike and flooded with the aggressive Sylvan memory construct, shattered internally. The pressure immediately left Kalen's head. He coughed, drawing the stale, electrically charged air back into his lungs. The casket's restraints, dependent on the main array, went slack. He was free, but the world was spinning violently. The Sylvan memory had retreated, but not without leaving a residue of pure, cold resignation, mingling with the adrenaline. Kalen clawed his way out of the casket, the biogel clinging to his ruined undersuit. He hit the cold titanium floor, ignoring the white-hot pain in his fractured shoulder. Shaw was moving, not toward Kalen, but toward the mnemonic. The cylinder was now pulsing violently, its residual energy flickering. The coolant blast had compromised the temporary field, allowing the protocol to leak out faster than before. The scent of sweet, paralyzing melancholy was now heavy in the industrial air. "Rix, you have ruined everything," Shaw screamed, his voice modulated by his battlesuit, thick with absolute fury. He was trying desperately to re-establish control over the transfer array. Kalen pressed himself against the catwalk support, trying to see Zora. The drone core indicator light was gone. Zora. Silence. The drone core had sacrificed its last joule of power to execute the shunt. Kalen had exchanged his only loyal ally for a few seconds of necessary chaos. Shaw's tactical drones, 3 sleek automated spheres, detached from the Auditor's hull and descended on Kalen, energy weapons charging. Kalen didn't run. He looked at the chaos he had wrought. The transfer manifold was sparking uncontrollably, the coolant freezing and corroding the exposed circuitry. He needed one final destructive act to ensure Shaw couldn't simply restart the process before Zarnell arrived. His eyes fell on the primary data storage link, the large, reinforced cable that ran from the temporary containment platform directly into the Auditor, Shaw's personal command ship. It was the only secure data conduit remaining. He grabbed a severed piece of the coolant piping, a 3-foot length of rusted lead tubing, and pushed himself forward, dragging his body through the smoke and electrical haze. One of the drones fired. The beam struck the floor plate 10 centimeters from his foot, superheating the titanium and sending blinding white light into the smoky air. Kalen reached the cable. It was thick, braided, and running hot with crucial data. The Sylvan protocol, now being desperately transmitted to the Auditor for external storage. He swung the heavy lead pipe, not with brute force, but with the specific, angled impact of a man who spent his life dismantling complex systems. He struck the cable exactly where it emerged from the floor conduit, shattering the internal shielding and causing the power feed to spike. The cable bucked violently, then exploded in a dense shower of copper and synthetic fiber. "No!" Shaw yelled, watching his secure data link vaporize. The feedback traveled instantly to the Auditor. The ship's automated defenses, interpreting the massive data surge as an internal critical breach, went into lockdown. Hull plates slammed shut, defensive systems armed. The ship, designed to be Shaw's mobile headquarters, was now a sealed fortress, incapable of providing external support. The 3 drones, now receiving conflicting commands, attack Rix, return to ship, quarantine, hesitated for a critical half-second. Kalen used that half-second to dive into the shadow of the colossal mnemonic hull. Shaw's enforcers, now disoriented and fighting the spreading cognitive infection leaking from the core, stumbled towards the wreckage. They weren't fighting Kalen, They were fighting the perfect logic of cosmic surrender that was now spreading through their unshielded suits. One of the enforcers stopped, staring blankly at his own armored glove, then slowly lowered his weapon. The Sylvan infection had found a host. Shaw recognized the immediate tactical loss. He had the core, but it was leaking. His communications were jammed. His command ship was in lockdown, and his men were being philosophically neutralized. He could not risk remaining exposed. Abort! Retrieval team, secure the mnemonic core and withdraw. Leave the prisoner. He is contaminated and irrelevant, Shaw ordered, his voice clipped and final. The surviving enforcers, moving with a chilling slowness, attached kinetic stabilizers to the mnemonic core and began towing the immense cylinder toward the geometric hole the auditor had punched in the hangar door. Kalen watched them go from the shadow of the black hull. He was slumped against the cold metal, his breath coming in ragged, painful bursts, every muscle screaming defiance. They left him. They left him alive. Pinned beneath the wreckage of a successful, desperate ambush. The chaos subsided quickly, replaced by a heavy, profound silence. The hangar was a ruin. Twisted metal, shattered glass, and the thick, pungent odor of burnt electronics dominated the space. Kalen reached down, his fingers finding the broken connection point of the neural siphon still dangling near his shoulder. The sting of betrayal, the loss of Zora, the surrender of his own consciousness, was sharper than the shrapnel lodged in his flesh. He was alive. He had saved the sector from immediate, total cognitive collapse. He had forced Orvik Shaw to flee, severely damaging his operational capacity. But the price was absolute. He had destroyed all physical proof of Shaw's illegal activities, vaporizing the data link and sealing the auditor. He had sacrificed his only functional ally, Zora. And the Sylvan relinquishment protocol, the poison of perfect despair, was now fully integrated into the architecture of Hangar 7 Delta, an invisible corrosive cloud of meaninglessness. Kalen struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on the lead pipe. The hangar was vast, quiet, and terrifyingly cold again. He had won the tactical exchange, but he was alone, injured, and 6 hours away from the arrival of Zarnell, a mercenary who would arrive at a silent, booby-trapped ruin, chasing the cryptic ghost of a woman Rix had failed decades ago. He looked around the industrial graveyard he had created. He had not escaped the trap. He had merely replaced a physical prison with a philosophical one, turning Hangar 7 Delta into the final, deadly staging ground for a man he had paid to save him. The irony tasted like the cold, chemical ash in the recycled air. He had survived the enemy, but the coming rescue might be what finally killed him. The strobing emergency lights of Hangar 7 Delta had cycled down, replaced by the deep, pervasive gray that precedes total battery exhaustion. The chaotic screams and the static crackle of overloaded comms were replaced by the sound of Kalen Rix's own ragged breathing and the slow, heavy drip of melted coolant condensing on the cold, titanium plates. He remained slumped against the immense black hull of the mnemonic, the metallic cold absorbing every calorie of heat his armor provided. The silence was vast, a suffocating vacuum where adrenaline once lived. He was intact, structurally speaking, but every joint felt packed with grit, every muscle fiber screaming exhaustion. The scent of burnt composites and ozone was slowly being overwhelmed by the familiar thick odor of cosmic dust and the new, sweet scent of sylvan melancholia, a cognitive miasma that settled deep in the lungs and whispered subtle, paralyzing truths. Kalen pushed himself away from the derelict vessel. His first objective was confirmation. He crawled toward the spot where Zora had perished. The drone core lay shattered near the lead piping, a blackened hemisphere of inert metal. The single, small indicator light that had been his eyes and his conscience for 5 years was dark. The silicon cracked by the feedback loop. He did not speak. There was no need for formal eulogy. Zora's sacrifice had been purely logistical. She was gone, a tool expended in a successful calculation, the cost of 5 seconds of chaos. He rose slowly, leaning on the heavy length of lead piping, now his only weapon and his only cane. Orvik Shaw had fled, but not empty-handed. Through the ruptured hull opening, the geometric tear. The auditor had punched. Kalen saw the skid marks left by the massive kinetic stabilizers. Shaw had successfully towed the mnemonic core out. He had lost his ship, his operational stability, and his reputation. But he had secured the ultimate asset, damaged but portable. The Sylvan Protocol was now loose, floating somewhere in the dark, heading toward a lab where Shaw hoped to decode its lethal logic. Kalen surveyed his domain. The hangar was a graveyard of his own making. He had destroyed the primary data link, ensuring Shaw had no clean copy of his transactions. The auditor was a pressurized tomb, sealed by its own safety protocols. He had successfully burned all the evidence of his own involvement and the vast scope of the threat. There would be no arrest, no interrogation, only an official inquiry into a massive, inexplicable industrial accident involving a toxic coolant breach. The Federated Powers would find nothing but ruined salvage and the spreading cloud of philosophical inaction, the slow, creeping sense that nothing truly mattered, which the cleanup crew would blame on poor air filtration. The greatest victory Kalen could claim was turning a war of cosmic information into a bureaucratic headache. He limped toward the exterior access door, dragging the lead pipe. He was injured, adrift, and contaminated by alien certainty. But he was alive. He was a survivor, which, in the cold calculus of the galaxy, meant he was merely a more persistent problem. He stopped near the primary access console. Zarnell was due in approximately 4 hours. He could wait. Zarnell would arrive, analyze the scene, the destroyed transfer array, the missing core, the sealed auditor, and immediately understand the depth of the betrayal and the scale of the failure. Zarnell had been promised payment and leverage. Kalen had neither to give, only a vast, contaminated ruin. More critically, Zarnell was coming for Sora Witt. The ghost Rix had failed. Kalen had hoped the mnemonic asset would be the key to neutralizing the Orvik Shaw syndicate, providing Zarnell with the freedom to pursue her agenda. Now, all Kalen had was the leakage. He could not, in good conscience, let Zarnell walk into this cognitive contamination. The Sylvan residue might not kill a man, but it would certainly destroy his motivation to fight. Kalen spent the next hour working with the last dregs of emergency power. He didn't try to fix anything. He used the remaining ceramic polymer sealant, the same high-density goo he had used in the first place to contain the mnemonic's presence, and sealed the massive rupture Shaw had created. He worked slowly, meticulously, turning the gaping hole into a thick, solidified scar. His goal was isolation. He wasn't sealing the world out, he was sealing the residue in. When the Federated investigation arrived, Hangar 7 Delta would read as a critical containment hazard, a derelict structure far too toxic to be worth salvaging. He returned to the access airlock. He left nothing but the scorched titanium floor and the spreading invisible despair. No note, no signature, no body. He walked through the final, functional airlock, jettisoning his battered salvage armor into the deep space transfer chute, ensuring no biotrace remained. Kalen Rix stepped out onto the maintenance catwalk of Verlassung Dry, clad only in his ruptured undersuit, a phantom blending into the endless grey noise of the scrap station. He was just another tired face among the millions of workers, defined only by the hollow ache of his fractured shoulder and the cold, unshakable truth lodged in the back of his mind. He was in debt, friendless, and the only man in the galaxy who knew that the fight itself was statistically meaningless. He looked down at his gloved hands, still stained with the millennia-old lubricant and cosmic dust from the mnemonic. The cold radiated up, not from the floor, but from within his own bones, a pervasive, final cold that tasted of dead batteries and confirmed despair. He had bought a ruined hangar for 1 credit. The final payment for that piece of knowledge was eternal solitude. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science